Today's topic is reframing FrameNet data. However, we have some other things to attend to before we get to that. We're going to discuss the assignment from last night. In fact, I'm going to invite Michael to oversee that discussion because, as you might have already understood, I've lost my voice. Then, as promised on the schedule, today we will provide synthesis to what we've been talking about for almost a week and a half now. And then we're going to begin to address reframing FrameNet data. Just as a reminder, I have office hours today. For tomorrow continues what you started for today. That is most of chapter 6 in what we call the book. And you'll be responsible for everything until page 84. So from 73 to 84. Now let me ask Michael to take over for the discussion of the assignment yesterday.
Good morning, bon dia. Everybody should have last night gone home and pounded their head against the sentences that we gave you. As we said in the assignment, you're supposed to examine them. You're supposed to figure out what. Well, here it says singular frame, but of course, in the example sentences, you might find multiple frames. That wouldn't be unexpected, especially given the discussion from yesterday. You shouldn't be surprised about that. Then figure out what the frame elements look like, you should find which sentences fit a frame that you define in detail. So I'm going to start off very American style, just asking, were there any amazingly burning questions that anybody had that they feel like we need to discuss before we can even go any further? Okay, no terrible burning questions. So I am still going to, I'm going to enforce some student participation here because I want to have some volunteers, and hopefully not only usual suspects, to offer up an idea for at least one frame that they found in the data. So anybody, can somebody raise your hand, tell me if you have an idea about at least one frame that you found in the data.
Cool.
Yeah.
The policy I've adopted is that if nobody volunteers, I help them volunteer. I strongly recommend that you adopt that policy.
Well, if assistance is required, then I can do that. Yeah. Okay. Do you have I'm sorry, your name?
Well, one frame I found in the corpus is one which is very similar to the American cause to fragment frame. Okay? And the valence seems to be similar, although, well, correct me if I'm mistaken, but when it's causative, in its causative valence, some frame elements can be null instantiated, especially the cause and the pieces element. Especially, yeah, it depends a lot on the context. For example, in the context of chemistry, the pieces element is usually instantiated because it's deemed to be relevant for that context. As for the cause, it's usually null-instantiated, especially when I have passive voice, which is the most frequent pattern I found.
Okay, I don't have anything terrible to say about this. And how many people here found that frame? Let's see some hands. Something that really seems like the same frame. Okay, a fair number of people. Okay, so somebody who did not find that frame or described a different frame, I would like to see a volunteer.
Na definição.
All right. In the formal definition of the frame, it is very similar to the definition of the frame in FrameNet, but I consider that instead of separating into pieces, breaking could refer to a discontinuity, to use the term from Filmer in the article we read. He says of discontinuity, something not continuous. It is possible break the leg bone without separating that into pieces. So in the definition of the frame, I considered that separating into pieces would be optional, or separating in constituent parts. The difference is that the pieces don't have a specific function, but the constituent parts, for instance, in the sentence about the water molecule that is broken liberates oxygen and hydrogen. That would be parts and not pieces. That's how I made this difference. And since the hydrogen and oxygen have both function and a certain identity, that's the difference that I found about the frame on FrameNet.
Okay, thank you. So it sounds like overall what you're proposing is not something which is, as far as I can understand, different because this is Portuguese, but basically you're saying, well, I look at the FrameNet frame and I would make these modifications. That seems reasonable. Let me outline. Let me rephrase, not reframe, but rephrase a couple things you said, because I think they're right. One thing that you say, which is that there doesn't have to be a separation, but discontinuity is perfectly fine. So, for example, if I broke a teapot, I would still call it broken, even if the pieces were not separated from each other. So in this case, as in many others, we have described the prototype, the most prototypical case, the usual case. So normally, when something is broken, we expect that the pieces are separate. So that's a legitimate point, but it's handled by, in general, you should, when you look at FrameNet frame, you shouldn't think absolutely every piece of this must be present for every sentence. What you should think is this a reasonable center of a prototype that covers, in the same category, the sentences I'm looking at? So absolute agreement there. In terms of talking about body parts, in terms of bones being broken or things like that, we're probably going to have some more discussion, I anticipate, about that because, let's just say that it's not clear that that should be covered by the same frame. I'll open that part of the discussion. Even though in the article by Fillmore, it's implied that these are all the same idea. But as you see, from what we were talking about yesterday, FrameNet has already broken down into smaller pieces the analysis of Fillmore, and so we pull apart a lot of things. So I think I've talked about your points. Is that right?
Ponto certo. I've thought of maybe in FrameNet this matter relating to body parts. Maybe it would be represented in another frame, break apart.
Not
No
cause to fragment.
No cause to frame, not in the cause to fragment. Maybe the FrameNet has already divided or reframed the two situations.
Aqui eu considerei
The one that I considered together.
Yeah. But we're going to have to talk about why. So we have not, you have an intuition that some people would consider them separate. I have an intuition that some people would consider them separate. And one of the things I want to come out before we move on is how do you turn that intuition into an argument instead of just saying, I think they're different. Okay.
Well, Mike, I, in fact, did not check in the FrameNet how the verb break was done. So I believe my, well, what I did was, I asked 5 speakers, what do you think when I say quebrar? What do you think of? And all of them described the scene of an agent breaking something with his hands. Yep, it's fun because 2 of them used the same example because there is a channel, the Universal Channel is finishing the House series, and the house, the character appears breaking his walking stick. So 2 of the speakers used the same example. Oh, I think about quebrar like House breaking his walking stick. That image was how they described it. So what I was thinking about was I proposed to have different frames for break as an adjective frame, and something that now I'm calling cause to break because I didn't look at the, you said cause to, it wasn't cause to fragment that in the American frame. So I've proposed the adjective to be a different frame from the causative because I feel, and I was trying to understand here with you that when we have adjective and passive or causative, we have very different, I feel, how can I say, they're very different phenomena, like for chemistry, for body parts. So I believe the adjective causative is an important distinction in this case, in the case of the LU quebrar.
So I will say that first of all, there's no guarantee that Portuguese will work the same as English. I've worked very closely with Carlos Subirats on Spanish, and we know that Spanish does not always work the same as English, so that wouldn't be surprising. However, in order to decide whether or not we should split the idea of causative versus agentive, we would need to make an argument, right? Rather than having an intuition, we have to make an argument. So what would be the basis of this argument? Does, what's that?
Wait a minute,
Yeah.
let's write it down.
Okay. I could wait. So the argument should consist of the things that we were talking about before. So what were the things that we talked about yesterday? Rather than asking you guys, we need to move on relatively quickly. That's what I was going to say. So one, you should look at polysemy patterns. So first of all, if every word that you can think of, which is a synonym for agentive break, so I broke my walking stick, so then think of other synonyms that you can put in there. Can they also be used in non-agentive causative cases? If every one of them has the same alternation, that's some evidence that it's a single category. They're different, but still you should put them together. It's not the finish of the evidence, it's not the end, but it is a piece of evidence. From what I understand, having talked to a few people, I think that this works in Portuguese as it does in English, that in general, the agentive breaking verbs can also be used to talk about a non-agentive, like the wind doing something can describe the same situations that an agentive breaking can. Okay? So that's one piece of evidence. Another piece of evidence that you should look at is, do they have the same frame elements or not? And if they do, then it's easy. That's another piece of evidence that they are in the same frame. If they don't, then now you have something more complicated. I believe, as I've mentioned yesterday, in the case of causative versus agentive, in the causative frames, there is no instrument available. So this is, on the face of it, a possible piece of evidence that you should split the frames, right? Because you could say, there's an agentive scene which also has an optional instrument, and there's a causative scene that has no possibility of instrument. So, core frame elements, that's right. So yes, these are core frame elements that you should worry about, but those are the only ones that are even going to be a problem at all, because the non-core frame elements should be the same for everything that's even vaguely similar in meaning. So if it's an event, it should have time, it should have place, things like this. So that shouldn't even come up as a deep concern. Okay, so now it seems like we have evidence in favor of a frame split, right? There's two different frame elements, different frame element patterns, and evidence against, because every verb that you can use agentively for breaking, you can also use causatively. So what we've done in FrameNet is we say that there is a productive alternation inside the frame. And one reason why we've done this is because a huge number of verbs in English, and I also assume in Portuguese, has this productive alternation. Every verb that can be used agentively can be used causatively. It's not true for all cases. So, for example, in English, murder is only agentive, and you cannot say the boulder murdered my climbing partner as we went up the mountain. And there are also cases which are only causative. Those are harder to find. And in fact, I'm not going to remember one right now. So both situations, those situations do exist. And in those cases, we very clearly want a separate frame. And if you look in FrameNet, you'll see we actually do have a separate murder frame from killing, which is much more general. And there's a huge number of words that are all in the killing frame, including to poison and so
on. In Portuguese, sometimes we have the verb vitimar, which is almost always used with a cause, not with an agent. So it's hard, not impossible, to say the killer, o assassino vitimou 10 pessoas. It's more common to say the storm did it. A tempestade vitimou 10 pessoas ou o acidente vitimou 10 pessoas.
Actually, oh, sorry, slight delay. I have thought of an example, result. The verb to result, the only kind of subject you can have is a causative. It has to be an event, and it's not possible to have an agent in that case. Again, that would be clear evidence that it should be in its own frame. Okay, so do we need to move on? Still have a little time? Good, because it has already come up, the possible distinction between injury, where you break a bone, and and other kinds of breaking. People have put that out there as a possible idea. We have an intuition that there might be a difference. What are some of the forms of argumentation that we can use to decide whether this is polysemy or just a very broad frame that includes lots of things? So I'm going to ask for volunteers and then provide a volunteer if I don't get one.
I don't know if I am right, but I think they are separate frames, and I thought about other words like torcer. I don't know how to say torcer in English.
To twist.
Twist, twist. I can say twist my foot, twist. So I thought twist, and I think it's like breaking legs and hands, and twist can't be in the same frame as breaking an object. I think they are very different. So I'm assuming that it can be a reason for separate frames.
So it sounds like what you're saying is there's a separate idea of injury, yes, which is brought up by some senses of break. Does one piece of evidence that you would want to look at, what about synonyms of break?
Yes.
Do all synonyms of break also have an injury sense?
I think I thought about similar meanings. I can't say now a synonym.
So in English, I will say that the other synonyms like to shatter, or to fragment, or to snap, those are all possible also in the injury meaning. Okay. So that's at least evidence. Again, like I say, these are all pieces of evidence, and you have to use them in your argument. This is evidence that they are the same frame. Okay. That's not the end of the matter, but that's evidence. Does anybody else have an idea about? So we still, I'm still keeping the idea strong that there might be a distinction. You know, because I have a deep intuition that agrees with other people's intuition that these are different. But so far, we haven't seen the evidence. So does anybody have an idea?
Tem uma ideia? We've chosen the frame as break as a body injury, so we describe this frame. We notice that when we say that Maria broke her foot, Maria is not the agent. She's not the one who causes the break, so she would be the experiencer, the person who experienced that, somebody who suffers the breaking. So that would be another role that is not an agent. So the one who suffers the breaking is a part of the body, so it would be different.
First of all, that's a really awesome point. Thank you. So frame element distinctions is absolutely something we should worry about. I will point out one thing that will undermine that idea is that even when I say I broke the vase or I broke the teacup, that those are also not always agentive, right? So, you know, I can do them agentively, right? I can take a teacup and, smash it on the floor, but it can also be by accident. And that's, in fact, even with what we're calling the causative agentive break, those are probably the majority of the cases in the corpus. So when you look in the corpus, most of the time people say, I broke my dish when I was washing it, or things like that. So it's a good point because in the injury sense, there seems to be a real difference between the causative. So I can also take a sledgehammer and break your leg if I'm an evil guy. So that would be agentive, right? And I can use the same verbs. I can say I broke your leg, I shattered your leg, I snapped your bone. These things are possible. So again, maybe we don't have the evidence to say that these are separate frames, but we still retain the intuition. So should we move on? Okay, let me do a finisher by saying there is evidence, at least in English, that they really are separate. And the evidence in English is that there is an extra frame element in the injury sense. So in English, for injury verb, all of those injury verbs that you guys brought up, there's the thing that causes the injury, which has a special marking. So I can say, I burned my hand on the stove. I twisted my ankle on the stair. I broke my arm on against the door of the car. So that's an extra frame element, which does not exist at all for the non-injury cases. So that would be real evidence. And for that case, there's no way to keep them in the same frame. So everything which is an injury has that frame element. Everything which doesn't have an injury does not have that frame element. So even though there's a productive alternation, it seems, even though many other things are true, we still have to make a separate frame because we just have different frame elements. Okay? So now I'm going to turn it back over to Miriam, who's going to do some synthesis.